Chapter 1. The opponents were evenly matched. In fact, the general word in the public prosecutor's office was that Monsieur Froget, the examining magistrate, won, would finally fall on his face, which would not be entirely displeasing to everyone. He sat in front of his desk in a seemingly uncomfortable position. One of his shoulders was higher than the other, his head hunched forward, as usual. He was all black and white, the whiteness of his skin, of his old-fashioned Bressant hairstyle, and of his starched linen, the blackness of his formal three-piece suit. He was, in short, slightly anachronistic. There had been many a time when others had wondered whether age had finally crept up on him, as there was a certain aspect to him that made him look 60 years old. I had been a frequent visitor to his house on the Champ de Mars, and I would like to offer my personal impressions of him. No man had ever been able to crush me, or had me doubt my own opinion of myself as much as Monsieur Froget. I would tell him a story. For example, he would look at me in a way that might appear slightly encouraging. I would finish. I would wait for an opinion, a comment, a smile. He would always stare at me fixedly, as though he were focusing on a landscape or a piece of evidence. Then he would finally let out a little sigh. Well, I swear to you, there's such an intensity in a moment like that, it would give one enough humility to last a lifetime. Nothing but a sigh, a breath of air. This is how I would interpret his response. And you went through so much trouble just to tell me that. This was an example, by the way, of only the most superficial aspect of his personality, and I will no doubt get a chance to speak about what I might have gleaned about his true nature. Nonetheless, that day in his office, a struggle was taking place in the manner that I have just described, that one could not even qualify as icy. He was dealing with Ziliouk, that world-renowned adventurer who had been in all the papers for weeks, a Hungarian or Polish, or Lithuanian, or Latvian. Nobody knew exactly Jew who, at 25, had already been expelled from 5 or 6 countries in Europe. He had been arrested in his luxurious Paris residence. Was he now 35 years old, or 40, or 30, or less or more, after a warrant issued by the president of the council, to whom he had proposed a business arrangement in his usual commodity diplomatic documents. Genuine or fraudulent general opinion was split. Ziliouk had already sold Soviet documents to England, which had caused a ministerial crisis and a breaking off of diplomatic relations between the two countries. He had sold Japanese papers to America and American ones to the Japanese. There were signs of his activities in Bulgaria, in Serbia, in Rome, and in Madrid. He was quite handsome. He was more than elegant. He was almost opulent. And yet he sported, on the whole, a heavy, flashy foreign accent. Monarchs, heads of state had all written to him. He had infiltrated most of the world's diplomatic circles. As soon as he was arrested, he had become aggressive. Eventually, you will be forced to release me, and then you'll be in hot water. He would insinuate that he was, in fact, working for the Deuxième Bureau, against and on behalf of everyone, and that he had close ties to the British Secret Service. Not one single magistrate had wanted anything to do with this case. It was the kind of case that would break the back of an honest examining magistrate and put a sad end to his career. There was Ziliouk, dressed in his three-piece suit from the best tailor in London, immaculate, with a vague smile on his face. An hour had gone by, and Monsieur Froget still would not speak to him. With the minute and precise gestures of a mouse nibbling at food, he read the mobile squad's report, at the top of which the accused could make out, in upside-down letters, the Ziliouk affair. He read through them, seemingly for the first time. Then he would look at the accused with that stare that was all his own, that concentrated stare that was as heavy as lead. It could not be compared to what can be called a piercing look, nor was it prophetic. It wasn't ferocious either. It was a calm gaze that would slowly zero in on a target and remain locked on it for hours and hours from that moment on. Ziliouk's first words were, as he lit a fancy cigarette with a calculated flippancy, "Smoke slightly bothers me." And perhaps for the first time in his career, the adventurer felt ill at ease, out of a need for bravado. He felt he had to declare, "I would prefer to warn you that your efforts will be in vain. I have been accused of selling false documents to France. I defy you to put me away on that charge. I have also been accused of providing Germany with equally counterfeit diplomatic documents in respect to French foreign policy. Nobody has seen these documents. The only accuser is an underling working for the 12th Bureau, and I'll do my best to prove that he's playing both sides. Just as I'll do my best to prove that I was extremely useful to the 12th Bureau. There was no reply. Monsieur Froget lowered his eyes onto a new report, which he read in its entirety. This went on for an hour, and Ziliouk searched in vain for any sign of curiosity, of fever, of passion, in short, any trace of human emotion. He spoke once again. Even if I am found guilty, I'll get 3 years maximum, just as X and Z. He named spies who had recently been convicted by the French courts. After that, France will have to pay dearly. The papers crackled before Monsieur Froget. The judge continued to read. He had Ziliouk's identity papers in front of him, each one more counterfeit than the next. In truth, one would have a hard time establishing for certain that he was born in one country rather than another. In turn, he had called himself Carlyle, Sunbeam, Smitt, Keller, Lipton, Rocher. There had undoubtedly been other names as well. He had been carrying $50,000 in his pocket at the time of his arrest. Monsieur Froget had not yet asked a single question after an hour and a half of this tete-a-tete. The report he had just read was a military one. 10 years earlier, Ziliouk had been arrested in Germany under somewhat mysterious circumstances. He had been released a month later, even more mysteriously, and had, in the meantime, been visited in his cell by one of the chiefs of the Wilhelmstrasse. That this man was dangerous, that was obvious. That he was riffraff, he bragged about it. But as he said himself, he left no loophole for action in the courts. And Monsieur Froget remained motionless, his left shoulder still higher than his right one, his indifferent gaze landing at times on his papers, or at other times on the accused. "Do you recognize this photograph of your last mistress?" he asked in a cheerless manner. Ziliouk burst out laughing, barely. "Monsieur le Juge, barely. She was a charming girl from Picrat's, the bar on the Rue Daunu. I rarely saw her," and his laughter became ambiguous, smutty almost. He dared to add, "Is she a friend of yours?" What language did you use to speak with her? Once again, Ziliouk felt like being vulgar. He answered with a sentence that is impossible to print, but which did not make the magistrate flinch in the least. Well then, at certain times, she spoke to you in a patois from Lille, and you answered her in this same dialect, which bothered her, because she did not think that she was understood by a foreigner. She had said certain things which were rather derogatory. Ziliouk remained silent. The judge remained silent for almost a quarter of an hour. The file was examined slowly, followed by a file which bore in big letters on its yellow envelope the Stephen affair. Ziliouk was able to read the thick letters, just as Monsieur Froget could, and the former allocated enough time to prepare his answers. His every attitude. It was an 8-year-old file that had been classified for as many years. It pertained to a certain woman named Stephen, who had been married to Pierre Stephen, and who had been murdered under rather troubling circumstances by her lover, a Polish worker who had disappeared without a trace. Pierre Stephen was a foreman in a chemical factory to which an artillery officer had been detached, presumably for research of considerable interest to national security. Around that same time, documents, most notably a description of a new gas mask, had disappeared. At that time, the Stephens were also leading a lifestyle that they were not used to and had made certain expenditures which did not match their actual incomes. And then there was the dramatic event itself. Stephen's wife was found dead at the foot of a coal dump near the factory. No one knew much of her lover. He had been spotted prowling around the region. He lived in the barracks of a veritable tribe of Polish workers. But his mates did not know what factory he worked for. They did not even know his name. He had disappeared on the very day of the murder. He was sensitive to the fact that the battle was shifting to another level. And from then on, Ziliouk's flippancy increased along with his chances of checking into the morgue. I do not know what you are trying to insinuate here, he said with aggressive irony. If you'd like, I could answer you just as well in a Javanese coolie patois, or the argot of the workers in a Ford plant. This was quite true. He was such a polyglot that one of his files mentions his presence 3 years earlier in China, where he acted as a close advisor to a Southern general at the time of his arrest by an inspector who had been a member of the colonial police. He had noticed a pin on his tie, which had been woven by the Moais of Indochina, and struck up a conversation in the dialect of that tribe. No words could do justice to Monsieur Froget's disinterest, which had not changed since the start of the session. Most examining magistrates accumulate series of questions, endeavor to confuse the accused, from whom they often extract the sort of sentence which can pass for a confession. Monsieur Froget, on the other hand, gave his opponent time to think, and even time to think too much. His silences would last several minutes, the questions a few seconds at best. Up till now, he had asked but two. The specialist interested in such matters should count the number of words that issued from Monsieur Froget's lips during the course of this crucial examination. In a low voice, the judge now read a telegram that he had directed to the public prosecutor's office at Lille. Question: where do the Stephens come from? How long had they lived in Lille before the occurrence of that dramatic event? Answer: from the Loire country. The Stephens arrived in Lille, having come from Saint-Étienne 1 month before the crime. The Lille factory requested a few good specialists from the Saint-Étienne branch in order to start production on a new product. Stephen came in with the group that had arrived in the north in June. Monsieur Froget raised his voice for the third time. Can you tell me precisely where you were? 8 years ago, in the month of June. The crime had been committed around mid-July. In Berlin, Ziliouk replied without hesitation. And if you really want to know, I was in daily contact with the Wilhelmstrasse. I have no idea where you are going with this, but I would warn you that you are on the wrong track. I do not know the Stephens. Monsieur Froget turned the page, read through the last document that the Deuxième Bureau had provided him with, and said Pierre Stephen, foreman at the Saint-Étienne arms factory, suspected by his friends of fraternizing with enemy agents, despite any actual proof to that effect, had been sent to Lille on the recommendation of counterintelligence, where workers with his expertise were needed around the end of June. The purpose was to see whether documents would disappear in this case as well, before it was possible to establish Stephen's guilt, and especially to uncover his accomplices. His wife's murder at the hands of a stranger had changed things, and from then onward, Stephen's behavior was no longer suspect. Very shaken and prematurely aged by the tragedy. He had left the factory shortly after the dramatic events and became a night watchman for a business in Pantin. Monsieur Froget had still not even uttered 4 sentences. He stood up without exhibiting the slightest emotion. He revealed himself to be taller and larger than one would have imagined by just seeing him seated. He looked at Ziliouk as though at the most everyday object, and he pronounced wearily as though he were a man finishing a chore. As he brushed off his black hat with the inside of his sleeve, "I accuse you of voluntary homicide on the person of the woman, Stephen." "Why?" Ziliouk asked, lighting another cigarette. Monsieur Froget appeared not to have heard him. His attention seemed to be focused on a spot on his hat. "You have no proof at all," Ziliouk insisted. The word proof brought Monsieur Froget back to reality. He said slowly, "Proof of your guilt. Here it is from my file." You could only read the words, "The Stephen affair," and yet you told me I do not know the Stephens. Your use of the plural is your confession. Ziliouk absorbed the shock without flinching. He was worthy of his opponent, but he no longer spoke a single word. Nonetheless, Monsieur Froget did not give much importance to his victory. How could such an easy triumph matter much to him? After glancing once more at his hat, he added stingily, "A child would have been able to figure this out clearly. 3 clues and bits of evidence have convicted you, in addition to your confession, which constitutes the formal evidence against you." Monsieur Froget counted with his fingers. "First of all, your knowledge of the Lille patois. Secondly, the excessive speed and precision with which you answered me when I asked you where you were 8 years ago. During the month of June. Thirdly, the fact that you were a member of German intelligence." And then he concluded, "An everyday affair. The Stephens provide Ziliouk, a German secret agent, with documents of interest to national security. When Ziliouk learns that the Stephens are under suspicion and sent to Lille, he fears being turned in by his mistress and being convicted as an accomplice. He decides to eliminate her. After the murder of his wife, who was Ziliouk's tool, the foreman, Pierre Stephen's behavior no longer seems suspicious. Case closed. Then Monsieur Froget rang for the guards. Chapter 2. There was only one thing that was bothersome about Monsieur Froget's presence in that apartment, perched on the 6th floor of a building on the Rue Bonaparte. One could hardly decide what was more shocking, what was even becoming indecent, the apartment or the judge in black. As he focused on the sight of the drinking glasses, which were clear and round like targets, the two undercover policemen who had brought Monsieur Rodriguez into the apartment remained standing outside the door on the landing. The sheriff had gotten so used to the judge after 10 years that his presence fit him like a glove, to the point where he even forgot that he was there. As for Rodriguez himself, he added the final touch to the enigmatic atmosphere. He made it comprehensible. Even though a few days of incarceration took the edge off his asperity, there were 5 rooms with arched ceilings, as the apartment was directly beneath the line of roofs. There was no sign of any dining room, kitchen, bedroom, and yet the same ambiance permeated the space, a profusion of rugs dominated by purple-tinted reds, trinkets chosen for their strangeness, products emerging from the imaginations of all races, of all eras, couches in all the angles, low tables, pillows strewn about the floor. The only trace of practicality came from a cracked teapot, empty glasses, uncorked bottles, a Primus brand hot plate that was left on one of the rugs, and a toothbrush that was firmly planted in a champagne glass. There was something both refined and dishonorable about the apartment. It smelled of incense, rare aromas, and seediness. It was in keeping with the master of the house, who was tall, thin, and who at times resembled a fallen aristocrat, and at other times a worn-out clown. He was 55 years old. He dressed like an adolescent. Moreover, he powdered his face and dyed his hair. If one looked closely, one could make out a thin scar on the tip of his nose. As he would be the first to explain, it resulted from an operation he had undergone in order to change the shape of his nose and to make his face appear more harmonious. A man's first duty is to be handsome, just as animals are beautiful, just as flowers are beautiful. He once told Monsieur Froget he was repulsive, an old male coquette, a mixture of senility and a false sense of youth. The police reports, however, were categorical. His only unusual habit was that his visitors were mostly young people, almost all of them Spanish like him. Books were scattered everywhere. They were all written by the most opaque of poets. He was quite at ease, despite the accusation that hung over him. He managed to refrain from showing any fear. As was his custom, his skin was caked with makeup. He was the first to speak while the judge walked back and forth, as calmly as if he were taking his morning constitutional. You must admit that you are unable to unearth any evidence whatsoever against me, and that had you been handed 1,000 clues, you would still have a hard time trying to come up with any plausible explanation for such a crime. 3 psychiatrists confirmed that he was responsible for his actions, even though he was quite mad. And yet, he had committed murder. It was a moral and physical certainty, one of those obvious truths which, in some ways, pass for evidence. Monsieur Rodriguez received many guests. He gave the impression that he was a wealthy man. He enjoyed opium, and young people often came to smoke entire nights at his house. Amidst the pillows, the rugs, the drapes, all that silly and somber rubbish that exhaled a pungent aroma made up of drugs, sleaze, and human sweat. At 8 o'clock at night, on the previous Tuesday, the concierge had seen a young man that she hadn't noticed before go up the stairs. Towards the middle of the night, she heard a strange sound emanating from the staircase. She thought that Monsieur Rodriguez and his guest were drunk, because in the 6th arrondissement, people are as addicted to champagne as they are to opium and heroin. She pulled on the door pull, went to bed, opened the door a little later for a tenant who neglected to mention his name. Monsieur Rodriguez would always yell out his name very loudly. She would remark afterwards to the police. That morning, a body of a young man was found in the Seine in front of the Rue Bonaparte. He had been thrown from the top of the quay, and the body had attached itself quite by chance on a barge's mooring. He had been stabbed 3 times with a knife. There were no documents found in his pockets. The police were carrying out their investigation. That very day, she identifies the drowned victim. He is the son of the Duke and Duchess of S, who hold one of the most visible positions in the Spanish royal court. A detective introduces himself to Monsieur Rodriguez. He has already established that the victim, who was just passing through Paris, had let himself be dragged along by his rather dubious cohorts on an evening jaunt through Montmartre, Montparnasse, and certain bars on the Champs-Élysées. Since wished to become initiated in the ways of opium, they introduced him to Monsieur Rodriguez, who had invited him over. On one of the red carpets, the detective notices a few dark spots which experts consider to be, but without affirming it, human blood stains. My goodness, why not look instead at my finger, which I cut on Monday? Replied Monsieur Rodriguez. Did you cut yourself attacking your guest? And why on earth would I have attacked him? I maintain that he left this apartment on his own volition. I had walked him back to the corner of the Rue Bonaparte and to the Boulevard Saint-Germain. He was inebriated. He refused to take a taxi as I had suggested. He no doubt retraced his steps, made a wrong move along the quays where some thugs murdered him. Was this the first time that you had him over the first? But I had seen him before at the Pickwick's bar. Do you know his name? His family situation? Titles don't impress me. And the police report ends with a deposition from a Spaniard who had been at the Pickwick's bar with S. Rodriguez. S, while remaining casual, was nonetheless quite an aristocrat and kept his distances, especially in regards to Rodriguez, whom he considered a bit of a curiosity. He burst out laughing when someone spoke to him about our friend's prestigious but murky roots. I think I remember his crying out at that moment, "Magnificent! What a unique fellow!" This for Monsieur Froget. He had entered a smaller room, which was slightly more decorated than the other ones, and where the window panes distilled a sanctuary-like aura. A painting appears to dominate the room, grabs one's attention, absorbs all light. The portrait of a woman in a grand pose from head to toe. She is young and beautiful, with admirable red hair. The painter had chosen to portray her completely in the nude. The canvas is pierced in the middle, and it had obviously been torn recently. Monsieur Rodriguez follows the judge's stare as he begins his questioning. The very first question. In fact, who is this? The accused manages a telling smile. A smile that is at once crooked and reserved, a reflection of his entire persona. The portrait is at least 20 years old. Did you receive your guest in this room? In this room? Yes. And it is on that spot that the traces of blood were found on the Persian carpet. On what day did you hurt your finger? Monday, or rather on the eve of the... On what day had the painting been torn? On that same Monday. It fell. When I tried to put it back up, I hurt myself. How did you become so wealthy? In his wallet, Monsieur Froget holds the answer to a question he had asked via telegraph to the Madrid police. Until he was 17, Rodriguez was a simple underling in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He suddenly disappears after having announced to his colleagues and to his superiors that he has just inherited a certain amount of money from his uncle, who had settled in South America, and that he would be living in Paris from now on. That was where he was tracked down. In fact, 600,000 francs are deposited in his name in a bank on the Avenue de l'Opéra by a notary from Geneva, from whom Monsieur Froget possesses a telegram. No inheritance. Cannot betray professional secret. Rodriguez, however, does not hesitate to reply, I had some tickets for the end of the year grand lottery. You are familiar with our national lottery. One of my numbers was picked. The drawing was held at the beginning of January. Right the end of December. And yet, you left Madrid in September. I didn't want anyone to know that my fortune came from that lottery. Why not? He does not answer. He lights a cigarette, and his cadaverous hand, covered with dark hairs, trembles. You're clearly misguided, he sighs. Finally, why on earth would I have killed this boy? He surely didn't have any money on him, and I don't need money. So unless you start mentioning sadism, but the doctors who have examined me would disagree with you. I have several vices, but not that one. Have you ever been married? Never. He is categorical, with a trace of bitterness in his voice. Have you had many affairs? Any mistresses? I don't like women. Monsieur Froget looks at the portrait, then at the accused who is straightening his tie in front of a mirror. Do you have any enemies in whose interest it would be to compromise you? Rodriguez hesitates. Remain silent. Answer. You have led certain people to believe, and this is the general opinion in the world that you frequent, that Rodriguez is just a borrowed name, that you could have claimed a name that would have been significantly more important. No reply. But the cigarette shifts from one corner of the lips to the other, without any manual help, then returns to its original position. Please sit down as you were sitting on Tuesday evening. I was not seated. You were standing for hours and hours. Excuse me. At first, we drank in the room next door. We only came in here to get the opium pipes, and you smoked them standing up. We went back to the other room. That was out of character. That was your opium den, wasn't it? I don't see what you're getting at. Who prepared the pipes? But everyone had their own. How many did smoke? 6 or 7? At what point did the argument begin? There had been no argument, and I warn you, there's no point in trying to outwit me. Monsieur Froget walks towards the door, opens it, and speaks to one of the 2 police officers. Please, bring me a police photographer. Warn him that he will have to reproduce a rather large portrait. He remains in the first room where he carefully examines a collection of miniature ships inside some bottles. By accident, he knocks over an African mask with pale eyes and crimson lips. Rodriguez remained in the other half of the apartment. Finally, in the most natural way possible, the magistrate asks a question from where he is standing. Is it done? Monsieur Froget heard the sound of a surprised person who was trying not to look disconcerted. He walks toward the door, notices the accused who holds in his hands a piece of the painting, which has been cut apart at face level. He asks, "What's the rush?" This portrait is based on a photograph, so the original must still be lying around somewhere. I don't have it anymore. That's just what I thought. Rodriguez is a bundle of nerves. Despite the darkness of his skin, one can discern a few irregular red spots which seem to stain his cheeks as though he had been slapped across the face. Do you have anything to add? Monsieur Froget says sharply, without bothering to glance at him. His clenched fingers rip the thin slices of canvas. On one of them, one can still see a big brown eye with curved eyebrows. The judge opens and shuts the drawers from a little dresser. He leaves one of them open, the one containing a revolver with a mother-of-pearl grip. He leaves without looking at Rodriguez, enters the first room where, once again, he contemplates the 3 masts of the miniature ship through the green-tinted glass of the bottles. Monsieur Froget had just enough time to jot a few words down in his dime store notebook. He wrote with such a pointed-edge fountain pen that in the hands of anyone else would have surely put a hole through the paper-proof S, who had never been initiated into the world of drugs, smokes 6 to 7 opium pipes, and prepares these very pipes himself. Rodriguez's testimony, impossible. But Rodriguez feels the need to establish that S was still alive when he left the room with the window panes in order to hide the importance of the portrait. Assumptions, the concierge's deposition, traces of blood, a cut on the hand. Rodriguez spontaneously declares that he walked his guest home in the opposite direction from the Seine, insists on his being drunk, maintains that the soiree had taken place in the living room with the portrait in it, then retracts this statement. The portrait's role, 20 years old, just like Rodriguez's wealth, just like his obsession with aristocracy, the original destroyed or returned to an interested party, obviously torn during the night of the crime, disfigured as soon as it is supposed to be photographed. This is at the heart of the crime, because if Rodriguez had committed premeditated murder, he would have done it on the key itself, instead of taking the dangerous and painful risk of carrying the body himself. He attracted S to his house. However, S had humiliated him. He insisted on bringing him before the portrait of the naked woman, despite the fact that he was in the room next door. At that moment, Monsieur Froget heard the detonation of a gun deep in the apartment, and he let out a satisfied sigh. Much later, in the smoking room of Monsieur Froget's Chambre de Mars apartment, Monsieur Froget was surrounded by 3 magistrates and a psychiatrist, a boy who did not like women, the judge said, who, while in Spain, purposefully seduced the daughter of a high-level official within the Foreign Affairs office where he worked, but who must have finally given up on his unsuccessful marriage and settled for a sum of money in exchange for, among other things, an excessively compromising portrait. He is consumed by his situation. It eats him up. He is neither an aristocrat nor a peasant. The newspapers tell him all about the one who has become a duchess, about her husband, about her son. He looks at that portrait, which he had wanted to be in the nude, not for the sake of sensuality, but to strip it of any ounce of prestige. One day, he meets the son in Paris. The young man makes fun of him, treats him as beneath his notice. And so Rodriguez hatches a diabolical plan. inspired by 20 years of unquenched ambition. Place the sun in front of the portrait when he is half drunk. After this moral crime, he needed to commit a physical one in order to protect himself. And without the slightest transition, Monsieur Froget placed a bridge game onto the table. Chapter 3. It stood just 300 meters from the Port d'Orléans metro station. It was a 2-story, dirty brick house surrounded by a garden, which in winter was nothing more than a puddle of mud from which the branches of the bushes emerged. To the right of the door, which was pierced with a spy hole, an enamel plaque read, "Family boarding house, moderate prices." Monsieur Froget entered the premises on December 11th, 1929, and was greeted by a red-headed girl, whose face was sprinkled with freckles and who was wiping her hands, which were bloated with chilblains. There was nothing but chaos. The flooring tiles in the hallways were muddy. On the right, there was a dining room with 8 tables covered with tablecloths and opened bottles of beer. It smelled like a pharmacy. A young man came tearing down the staircase and left without looking at the judge, a boarder. Yes, there are only 3 left. The others are all gone. Is Madame Smitt feeling better? She's doing very badly. She says she's going to die. Take me to her. The room was neither on the first or second floor, but rather in a freezing attic, which was hardly furnished at all, and which one could enter only by a hallway that was cluttered with the boarders' trunks. The servant answered one of the judge's questions with, "You see, Madame Smitt prefers to rent the rooms and sleep here." Crudely illuminated by a light that came straight from a gable window, the landlady was in bed. She was so thin that one had a difficult time making out the curves of her body underneath the red covers. Her hair was in a bun, but in disarray. She had a yellow face with feverish eyes which glared cantankerously at the judge. Her shoulders were barely any bigger than those of a child. "Are you feeling any better?" She began to cough. At first, she might have been faking it, but the coughing fit came, and she had a devil of a time catching her breath, after which, without answering, she gave Froget a look which seemed to say, "This is what you're responsible for." The doctor determined that her condition, while not hopeless, was serious enough. A cold spell had sent her to bed for more than a day, when she expected it the least. It happened on December 6th exactly, On the 8th, a boarder, a waiter in a cafe in Montparnasse, found a dead dog in the garden that some urchins had thrown over the hedges. He had started to dig a hole in the ground in order to bury the carcass. He had been completely stupefied when he uncovered human remains. He had called the police immediately. Ever since, each day brought a little surprise. And, of course, Madame Smitt's condition worsened and worsened. She received the detectives with her teeth clenched, but looked at them with a stare that was as sharp as a stiletto knife. She had always been thin, servile, with a somewhat indefinable attitude, something that was both obsequious and terribly energetic. She owned the house. She ran it herself. She employed only one maid, and she worked from dawn to dusk. Her boarders were mostly English or American, despite being so close to Montparnasse. She rarely had any artists or students. More and more, her boarding house catered to jugglers, chorus boys, and people without any precise profession. Of course, the Criminal Records Office had taken possession of the body, which they had subjected to every possible examination. Their field of inquiry was limited. However, as the body had been dead for at least 5 years, the report read, "The deceased, who is of medium build, was killed by a fracture of the skull. At the time of his burial, he was wearing striped cotton pajamas. There were no particular clues to be found. He must have been around 35 to 40 years old." Madame Smitt answered all of the questions with hateful looks. One hardly had time to formulate a sentence before she would cry out, "I know nothing." The telephone and the telegraph were working, and as is often the case, it became clear that the seemingly insignificant Port d'Orléans house had been hiding a much more troublesome activity than one had imagined. Madame Smitt's origins were looked into. For example, her neighbors had taken her for a very meritorious widow, for an energetic woman who had fallen on hard times. Yet, Scotland Yard had responded to a questionnaire sent by Froget with the following cablegram: Natalie Esther Grant, the daughter of a clergyman from Kent. At the age of 16, runs away from home to London in order to follow a music hall clown who promptly abandons her. She was a quick learner, was hired by a commercial firm, 5 years later, marries the vice president, Richard Holloway, who handles her business affairs. Holloway becomes an associate at Grimborn and Mower, starts a working-class clothes manufacturing business, which doesn't turn a profit. Very disappointing bank statements. No credit. Just when bankruptcy seemed inevitable, someone who had just withdrawn cash from his account turned up dead in the Thames. The police traced the victim all the way back to the Holloway Grimborn Mower trio, to the store where it had been discovered that the murder had taken place. The crime occurred on January 25th, 1914. Extraordinarily, the payee only had 30,000 francs on him, which were still missing. Holloway confesses, is sentenced to 20 years of hard labor. Grimborn is sentenced to the same, and Mower gets 10 years. Holloway dies of consumption in 1918. Grimborn is still in prison. Mower had been released. In 1923, after an accident which cost him his right eye, the police know nothing about Mrs. Holloway, except that her complicity had not been established, and that she had left England as soon as the trial was over. But she resurfaces at the town hall of the 14th arrondissement in Paris, where, in 1921, she marries a certain John Smitt, a British subject and commercial traveler. At this time, she does not yet own her boarding house. She works for an Australian company in Paris. She doesn't move to her Port d'Orléans residence until a year later, with half of the house paid for in cash, or 30,000 francs to be exact, and the rest to be paid for from annuities. During the first days of the investigation, Madame Smitt had been asked questions about her second husband. In short, he disappeared immediately after your marriage. Why, I have no idea. Where did you meet him? No answer. Based on her mute responses, some police officers conclude that the body and John Smitt are one and the same. But Monsieur Froget remains silent, places an announcement in the newspaper, urging the said John Smitt to come forth, or to write to the sane prosecutor's office. On the 9th of December, a letter from Boulogne arrives, signed by Smitt, who alleges that he simply cannot go to Paris unless a warrant is issued for his arrest. He's a down and out. He says he's a docker, but he is in fact as much a docker as he had been a sales representative. When he met Mrs. Halloway, he was a sandwich man. She offered him 1,000 francs to marry her and to go away afterwards. She needed my name, he said cynically, but with no real understanding of the scheme he hoped to profit from. Madame Smitt's illness becomes even more useful to her now that it is authentic. Her fever oscillates between 39 and 39.8 degrees Celsius to see her lying down. One wonders how, just 8 days earlier, she was able to come and go freely at home. Drew. This was a question that was frequently asked. She had always been weak, sickly. The people in her neighborhood would say of her, "She's a poor woman who hasn't got 2 cents worth of health to her, but who gallops about town all day anyway, and a few boarders, who sometimes took pity on her, would take the broom or the cleaning rags right out her hands." As she lay in bed, her smile was the pathetic smile of a victim. Hadn't the entire world conspired against her, against a frail creature who had been worn out by sickness, and who never ceased to be tested and proven? Monsieur Froget coughed mechanically. The red-headed maid takes leave, but not without sending a disdainful look his way, as though he were an executioner. In the room below, a boarder, a saxophone player, needs to continue practicing despite everything. A strange sort of metallic wails rise from one floor to another. "Do you have enough strength to answer a few questions?" She remains silent, though smiling, and one should not be afraid of being accused of being cold-hearted by staying there after such a smile. "Why did you spend 1,000 francs to change your name in 1921? Even though you seemed keen on money at that time." She coughs to the point of losing her breath, and momentarily turns scarlet. "Nobody in France was aware of your husband's conviction. The past could not have affected you in any way as a result of this. It was the marriage, on the other hand, which was dangerous." She looked at him with a certain amount of concern. "I repeat dangerous, because a little later you would buy a house as a married woman. You had no choice but to buy it in your husband's name. You needed his signature. I know. You needed him to put his signature on all sorts of stamped documents. That notwithstanding, if he had wanted to, he could have demanded his share of the building. A pair of surprisingly cold and lucid eyes stared at the magistrate. Thin lips remained frozen. The face is yellow and pink, a sickly apple-cheeked pink. How many years have you had a maid? She answers no further. He consults his notebook. The one you are currently employing was hired in 1927. Before that, you had a maid from Brittany who began working for you in 1926, and yet the crime occurred around 1924 when you only had a housekeeper come in 3 or 4 hours a day. Madame Smitt has shut her eyes and her mouth slightly ajar, allows for only the most difficult of breaths. Under those conditions, it was easy for you to dig a hole in your garden and shove a corpse in it as soon as the boarders had left for the day. Silence. A sliver of a melody that the saxophone player attempts to begin 3 times and which ends in a sort of burst of incongruous laughter. From 1921 to 1925, Smitt wrote to you from time to time, from Marseille, from Bordeaux, from Calais, to ask you for little sums of money. You would send him 10 francs at a time. From 1925 onwards, you no longer answered his letters. I had had enough. She extends her arm towards a glass of water which had been placed onto the table. Monsieur Froget puts the glass in her hands. She avidly downs her glass and allows her head to rest on her pillow. Are you finished now? Her entire face is tormented. One could suppose that any minute could be her last breath. Monsieur Froget is cold. He turns his head as the old woman is still coughing, seemingly without end. He frowns as the saxophone player starts another piece with an exasperating slowness. Who owns the dumbbells that were found in the courtyard? They belong to a boarder who left them behind. Mower was blind in his left eye. Was he not? The right eye. Wait. Yes. When did you see him for the last time? 2 days before. Before the incident. In 1914. He was dining at our house. Give me another glass of water. He never wrote to you once. In 1926 or 27, a simple postcard from Canada. He wrote down his signature only. Was it a postcard of a big city? No, Wait, a frozen river, I think. Mower didn't ask you for any money. No, some water. I can't take it any more. Monsieur Froget filled the glass, handed it to her, left the room after one last glance at the old woman who was not drinking, but who, as she sat on her bed, followed him nervously with her eyes. Madame Smitt poisoned herself the day after having been transferred to the Saint Lazare infirmary, under circumstances which could never be explained. The only document of any use was Monsieur Froget's notebook, from which I copied the following lines. Madame Smitt is guilty of Mower's murder. Proof Madame Smitt states that Mower is blind in his right eye, and yet he became blind in prison. She therefore saw him after he was released from prison, which she denies. Assumptions. She spends 1,000 francs in order to marry Smitt, despite the serious perils of such a maneuver, while everyone in France has no knowledge of her past. Then it is not the authorities she wishes to flee, but someone who would be looking for her, and it is for this reason that she officially changes her name. This is how things played out. Mrs. Halloway holds on to the 30,000 francs that were stolen from the murdered man, goes to France, keeps the money. Her husband dies. Grimborn is locked up for 20 years, but Mower will soon be let out of prison. He is entitled to a share of that amount. In order to avoid sharing anything, she changes her marital status by marrying Smitt, moves to the suburbs, buys a house under her new name. Once free, Mower catches up with her anyway. She feigns submissiveness, offers him her hospitality, makes him drink, or fills him up with a narcotic. That night, she sneaks into his room as he sleeps and beats him to death with the dumbbells. Under no circumstances will she sell her house in order to give any part of it over to Mower. And in red ink in the margins, a classic case of someone desperately trying to hang on to ill-gotten profits. Chapter 4. It was the first time that Monsieur Froget had come into contact with a 72-year-old suspect, and it was likely that, perhaps from the very beginning of the case, he was impressed by him, even though he had not yet looked him in the face. He abruptly pronounced, "Would you blow your nose? I beg of you." The man's name was Boss. He was one of those human specimens that city people always seem to forget, but that in the past One could find at least one example in each village of formidable build, a chest like a trunk, almost as thick as it was large, and the whole was sculpted in a hard and lead-like material, a bear. Half of Boss's face was covered with grayish hair, 3 to 4 centimeters in length. He was sitting nervously on the edge of his chair, with his hat on his knees, ready, one could say, to leap at the first sign of danger, while the magistrate was flipping through the files. He kept his eyes shut for the most part, but his eyelids would lift from time to time, and a most piercing gaze would emerge that would strike Froget within the span of a second. A cold, worrisome stare that one finds in certain very evolved animals. He wiped his nostrils with the back of his hand and paused, inhaling and batting his eyelashes. His lips were drawn. One could feel him saying to himself, "He's clever. They're all clever in there, and they're going to try to fool me, but we'll see about that." And his entire body stiffened up. He pushed prudence to the limits, to the point where he made his shutter-like eyelids close onto his reddish pupils. The crime had been committed that very night. In the morning, Monsieur Froget had gone down to the crime scene at Aubervilliers, accompanied by the prosecutor and some experts. It was now, and would be henceforth, the most bitter memory of his career, a nightmare in every sense of the word. Leaving Paris, crossing the lively suburbs, arriving in Aubervilliers' culture and factories, and noticing, far from any house, a shanty in the middle of the fields, a cube. The inhabitants were uncomfortable when one brought up the Flemings. They speak of the hovel with embarrassment, and one of them felt the need to say eloquently, "We don't even know how many of them are in there, nor who's producing the urchins who are growing there." There were 4 rooms, a stable, nooks and corners filled with manure and agricultural instruments, chickens, dogs, cats and children, a hodgepodge blended within the filth. 3 women, a 50-year-old, a 22-year-old, and a 16-year-old. Then there was Boss, shuffling noiselessly through the dark rooms, creeping, slithering, spying, elusive. In a bedroom, to the right, a corpse. That one might mistake for Boss himself, if Boss hadn't been right there looking at him. Same build, same age, but with a useless head. The doctor counts 31, 32, 33 blows from the hammer. And no one cries, nothing but dry eyes, snarling faces, words whispered in Flemish. When the questioning begins, out comes a vague jumble of words, a pile of contradictions, and answers such as maybe, that could be, how should I know? You prove to people that they're lying and they couldn't care less. They just make up another story with the same thoughtlessness. Thoughtlessness. The word demands to be repeated almost obsessively to the point where one could be transported hundreds of years in the past to an era of obscurantism and amorality. One can hardly determine whose children they are. The 16-year-old girl is the mother of the latest one. And there's no point in even mentioning the existence of a father. Monsieur Froget was so accurate in sensing that things would only get murkier and murkier, not only on a daily basis, but on an hourly one, that he rushed back to his office and made sure Boss was brought in at once. The women are being watched on the spot. This doesn't seem to bother them, not any more than the corpse did. At noon, they ate a great big helping of potatoes in a sour milk sauce. Establishing the Flemings' exact identity is already a daunting task. Almost no documents at all. Only a Belgian military service record and a birth certificate. For better or for worse. However, Monsieur Froget starts some files in front of Boss, who opens and closes his eyes with almost rhythmic regularity. Boss, Jean-Joseph Alphonse, born in Niederterren of the Belgian Limburg region, agricultural worker, 3 years of military service in the 2nd Lancers Division at Arlon, sets off to America, returns 10 years later with 20,000 francs and meets Van Stralen, a real brute, with a full beard. Van Stralen, Peter Auguste, born in Niederterren, a journeyman, carried out his military service in the same regiment as Base, settled near Argenteuil, where he rented some land, got married a few years later to a woman 20 years younger than he. She had a gorilla's figure, snub-nosed Emma Van Stralen, born in Tongres, a brasserie waitress, up until the day she met Van Stralen in the Les Dalles district of Paris and marries him. Céline, their oldest daughter, 22 years old, mother of 3 children whom Boss fathered. According to local gossip, Louise, the youngest daughter, 16 years old. Boss would be the father of this child as well. When Boss came back from America with money he had earned in the mines, he began to seek out Van Stralen, his childhood friend. He found him in Argenteuil. He moved in with him. At first, he helped out with the work. Then the Aubervilliers shack went up for sale. Boss bought it. Van Stralen was, in fact, just a farmer. But in practice, the situation was much less cut and dry. No one kept any records at all. Boss lived there without doing anything. Van Stralen worked his land, and it was Emma who, at 3 o'clock every morning, harnessed the horse and brought the vegetables to the covered market in Les Halles. When Céline gave birth to her first child, Boss deposited 1,000 francs in a savings account in his name at the Caisse d'Épargne Bank, and the same was done for the rest, including Louise's child. But Céline was the only one to have her bed in Boss's room. Everyone else slept in the same room, and a 3-year-old urchin slept on the floor on a straw mattress. 2 years before, Boss had received a small inheritance, around 10,000 francs that he had put in the bank. He was totally illiterate and signed his name with an X. It was Van Stralen who, knowing how to read and write himself, took care of most of the paperwork. One question provoked contradictory answers. Did you also have relations with Emma Van Stralen? There were yeses and nos, some maybes, and some vague gestures. One fact was certain: Van Stralen was jealous of neither his wife nor his girls. Boss had all the power. Everything was his, the house and its hosts. And all this had continued for 30 years in Aubervilliers, an hour away from Paris by tram, with little contact with the civilized world, so to speak, nor even with the century itself, to the point where Boss did not speak French, but a pidgin language made up of Flemish, Spanish, and slang. The neighbors knew nothing of this. From time to time, they saw Boss pass by, silent and heavy, and swinging his arms like a large monkey. As for Van Stralen, one saw him only from afar, hunched over in his fields, laboring with a single-minded obstinacy, and always alone. All anyone knew was that the Fleming bought several liters of gin every week, and that Van Stralen played the accordion once in a while. In the evenings, at his doorstep, the previous night at 9 o'clock, the Flemings went off to bed in a disorganized fashion. At 3 o'clock, Emma had already left with the cart. When she came home at 10 o'clock, Boss and Celine were busy looking at the corpse. At least 2 hours had gone by since they had discovered it, but they had waited for the woman before calling the police. Each of them had claimed that they knew nothing, saw nothing, heard nothing. It took this crime to reveal that this same Van Stralen who had been found murdered had been sick for 7 weeks, paralyzed in his bed. As it was winter, the neighboring villagers had not noticed that he was absent from his fields. His family had neglected to call a doctor. He was dying. For goodness sake, Emma said, and since he was whimpering all the time, we had put up a bed in a poor room. From time to time, someone came over to check up on him. After the auto-spy, the coroner concluded that, even if he had not been killed, Van Stralen would have lived only 2 or 3 days. That wasn't the least of it. This murderous fixation on an inert body at death's door, who, moreover, was no longer in command of his faculties. 33 hammer blows. One might as well have said that he no longer had a head. The weapon had not been found yet. A well had to be emptied. Several swamps needed to be dried up. How did the criminal come in? Through the door when Emma leaves. Nobody gets up to bolt it. The autopsy had revealed that the crime had been committed between 6 and 7 o'clock in the morning, so that Emma, who at that moment had been at the Halles, was the only one not under suspicion. The stunned children, who should have been interrogated, burst into tears or babbled a few inchoate syllables. Boss was now seated in one of those booths in the Palais de Justice, crushing his chair with his own weight, trembling each time Monsieur Froget made the slightest movement. His nose was running once more, and, as he did not seem to notice it, the magistrate clicked his fingers impatiently. "Blow your nose." He obeyed, his eyes full of spite. Did Boss shave often? He had to repeat the question, and yet Monsieur Froget felt that the man had understood him. At first, He answered, on occasion, then on Saturdays, who was the last one to shave him. He was forced to repeat once more, as he hammered each syllable, me and Emma the other week shaved him so well, in fact, that no other stranger needed to set foot in the house. Against his usual pattern, Froget lit another cigarette. Redness surrounded Boss's eyes. His limp lips came down over his toothless mouth. He had a mixture of exceptional strength and decrepitude, and that cold stare which filtered through, extinguished, and then cautiously emerged once more. Van Stralen owned nothing. Nothing. Didn't he have any life insurance? This time, Froget had to listen to an entire explanation. It was as though each question went on forever. No. At what time do you normally get up in the morning? At 6 o'clock? 7? And Celine, the same. She stated that she got up at 8 o'clock. That's possible. Was it Louise who discovered the body? Could very well be. You said this morning that you were the one. So what? Boss grumbled at length before each word, his hands bulging with veins, his skin caked with earth. Were placed on his knees. The shape of his joints was no longer recognizable. 2 of his nails were blackened to the root. The telephone rang resoundingly. One of the detectives who had stayed in the shack announced that the wells had been emptied without result. Are the women still saying nothing? The old woman asked if she could still go to the house tonight. She's talking about some cabbage that might spoil. And the youngest, she's ironing some laundry, Céline. She cried. She comes and goes in and out of the house. You can tell she's got some sort of weight on her shoulders. Monsieur Froget hung up the phone, stared at Boss, who, during this questioning, kept his eyes shut. Give me the summons, the magistrate finally said to his clerk. He took the piece of paper, handed it to the old man, pointing out the bottom of the page to him with his hand, with his other hand. He offered him a fountain pen. What must I write down? Sign. Boss squashed a X down on the paper. Blow your nose. Monsieur Froget wrote down a few words on a form, pushed the paper towards the suspect without lifting his head, and, in a neutral voice, announced, "Here is the warrant for your arrest. Van Stralen." The hand with the bulging veins took the piece of paper. It was trembling, and as the murderer read, Monsieur Froget wrote, but slowly this time, in minuscule inky letters, on a page in his notebook, proofs 1. The suspect fell right into the trap that I had set for him. When I asked him, did Boss shave often? His answer from time to time exposed him. He forgets that he wants to pass himself off as boss. 2. The suspect asked what he should write down, and yet Boss could neither read nor write. 3. The same man who paid no attention to his appearance bothered to shave the dying man, who, by the way, had never been washed or cared for and wallowed in his own filth. Yet Boss's beard was the most striking difference between the two Flemish men, for none of them had opened their mouths, including Emma van Stralen, because it was in everyone's interest. Assumptions or clues. Boss, who was sick, was going to die any day. Yet everything belonged to Boss for 30 years. The family had lived exclusively on Boss's money. The two men were the same height, the same age. The neighbors could barely distinguish the two, shaving the dying man, finishing him off, and disfiguring him completely with hammer blows, passing him off as Van Stralen, and Van Stralen became Boss, the owner of the shack, of the fields, and of the money that was deposited into the bank account. This was premeditated since, for weeks, he had to let his beard grow. Monsieur Froget looked at the man who stood before him in a curious manner, with his drooping lip, his dead eyes, with a little wetness around his eyelids, and so he jotted down in the margins, before curtly closing his notebook, Motive the Land. Chapter 5. Conspiracy in the Dark. Monsieur Froget entered the cramped room of the Aubervilliers' house, where the Boss case was still unsolved. The atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The gray walls seemed to absorb every sound. Small details that had been overlooked now became important. A loosely locked door, traces of clumsy hands, and small items in the living room revealed new clues to Boss's true motives. Froget focused on observing the witness's eyes. The anxiety, threats, and even fear hidden in each gesture were carefully recorded by him, because in this case, human psychology was as important as physical evidence. Meanwhile, outside, Paris bustles, but beneath the surface of the streets, an elaborate plot is brewing, connecting the base case to other suspects in an international crime chain. Monsieur Froget knows that to solve this case, he will need not only sharp intelligence, but also a dark world where greed and betrayal control human actions. Chapter 6. The Blurry Traces. Monsieur Froget emerged from the Aubervilliers room, his eyes still intent on details that others would easily overlook. These seemingly trivial clues formed a complex chain of links between Boss and his potential accomplices. He decides to meet again with Henri Nucci, who had appeared in the theft and fraud. Through their confidential conversation, Froget realizes Henri's inner conflicts, ambition, fear, and tested loyalty. Traces of secret movements in the night, hidden letters, and small forgotten objects create a suggestive map of a criminal network. Froget carefully records every detail, knowing that one small mistake can ruin the entire case. Paris is still magnificent and bustling outside. But for Froget, every street can lead to danger or important clues. He realizes that the truth sometimes lies not in the light, but deep in the darkness and human psychology. The investigation enters a thrilling phase as Froget is about to face unprecedented surprises from the suspects. Chapter 7. Signals in the Dark. Monsieur Froget returned to Boss's old apartment, this time with the utmost caution. Every step, every glance he took was carefully observed, as if every detail might reveal the secrets the criminals wanted to keep hidden. Small clues, from footprints on the floor to ink marks on paper, gradually build up a picture of the suspect's true actions and motives. Froget knows that, in this case, intelligence and psychological acumen are as important as physical evidence. Meanwhile, Henri Nucci was behaving strangely, making Froget suspect that he was hiding more than he was admitting. his gestures, his looks, and even his awkward words were all carefully noted by Froget. Links between the Bass case and previous cases, such as Mrs. Crosby's theft and frauds in Europe, gradually emerged, creating a sophisticated conspiratorial criminal network. Paris is still bustling, but in the darkness of the city, Froget knows that every step he takes must be carefully considered, for the villains are not only sophisticated, but also dangerous. Chapter 8: Battle of Minds. Monsieur Froget sat across from Henri Nucci in the interrogation room. The dim light from the lamp, illuminating their tense faces, every word, every gesture carried hidden meanings that needed to be deciphered. A tense battle of wits ensued. Henri tried to keep his cool, but through sharp questioning and keen observation, Froget discovered inconsistencies in his testimony and motives. The connections between Henri, Boss, and the other suspects in the series of cases begin to become clearer. Froget realizes that this is not just a single case, but a sophisticated criminal network with sophisticated plots and tricks. Paris still sparkles with lights, but in the interrogation room, only the cold light of truth remains, and secrets are gradually revealed. Froget knows that to solve the case, he must continue to delve into the psychology of the suspects, find their weaknesses, and exploit the truth hidden behind the mask of lies. Chapter 9: Unexpected Turn. Froget's investigation enters a pivotal phase when an unexpected clue emerges, a hidden letter that reveals the connection between the suspects in the series of cases. This new information clarifies the relationship between Boss, Henri Nucci, and other suspects, and reveals a much larger conspiracy than originally thought. Froget feels the pressure and danger mounting, but also sees the light of truth emerging through the complex puzzle pieces. Every conversation, every observation becomes more important than ever, because even the smallest mistake can send a case off course. Paris still lives a bustling life, but in Froget's heart, layers of darkness and elaborate conspiracies are waiting to explode. Chapter 10: Duel Night. The Paris night covers every street, where intrigue and danger lurk. Froget and Janvier secretly follow the suspects, preparing for the most important confrontation in the case. The battle of wits began in a small, dimly lit room, making every gesture and glance of the suspects valuable. Froget focused his attention, exploiting every small detail to find the truth. The conflicts between Boss, Henri, and the others become increasingly tense, and lies and tricks are exposed piece by piece. The confrontation is not only about finding the culprit, but also a challenge for Froget's intelligence, spirit, and sharp observation skills. Paris at night is still magical, but inside, a battle between light and darkness is taking place. And Froget the Truth Hunter stands at the center. Chapter 11. The Truth Revealed. The morning light filtered through the interrogation room window, illuminating Monsieur Froget's tired but sharp face. The mind game that had lasted all night was finally beginning to reveal the truth. Henri Nucci and other suspects gradually confessed to shady acts, plots, and true motives that had been hidden for so long. Each admission was a piece that added to the complete picture of the case. Froget listens, observes, and takes careful notes, ensuring that justice is served, but not ignoring the psychological complexities and circumstances of each character. Paris is still bustling outside, but in Froget's heart, the light of truth has shone through the darkness, ending a complicated case, but also opening up many lessons about humanity and justice. Monsieur Froget knows that the quest for truth is never over, and there will always be new secrets waiting to be discovered. Chapter 12. The Report to the Polizei. Praesidium of Emden, which Monsieur Froget read to the accused, contained the following Otto Müller. Born in Wilhelmshaven in 1889 from a civil servant family, at 16, is hired as a dental assistant in Emden. After his military service, marries Lady Falcon, who is 10 years older than he is, moves into a comfortable apartment in Emden, and takes out several patents on a type of dental cement which he invented and which he manufactures with his wife and a servant. When war is declared, he has 4 or 5 patents, including one for an automatic syringe. At the front in 1915, gets himself attached to a hospital in Cologne. In 1919, is arrested in Hamburg for illegally wearing a major's uniform. gets divorced, and marries a former cafe concert singer. Elena Schramm returns to Emden, tries to jumpstart his business, borrows some money, goes bankrupt in 1928, lives in a hotel with his wife. Seems as though he has no means of making a living. On November 7th, 1929, requests a passport to go to Paris. Sets off alone. Another report that was equally typical from the research division in Paris on November 9th, 1929. Otto Muller checks into the Delta Hotel, Place du Delta, and claims to be an engineer. He is still wearing a worn-out hussar pelisse. Pays for the first week. For the second one, he makes the hotel keeper wait 3 days. Announces that he will be concluding a major deal in a matter of days. Asks the bellboy about cocaine traffic in Paris. On November 16th, tries to sell 10 grams in a cafe in Montmartre, mistaking him for an informer. The bartender refuses his offer. Muller makes a fresh attempt 3 days later, offers to sell his drugs at a laughable price. Still does not manage to unload them. Visits 2 or 3 German expatriates in France, including a dentist, tells them of his new patent, and tries to extract a significant amount of money from them. In vain. Goes back to one of them, and after 5 visits, borrows 200 francs, tries to get a job as an interpreter at a fancy hotel, pays for his room with increasing irregularity. The hotel keeper is of the opinion that he is probably not eating every day. 2 or 3 times a week, he is seen on the Rue d'Hauteville at the residence of Helmut Carr, a former colleague from Wilhelmshaven, who owns a small business selling tacky trinkets, pencil holders, cheap pens, ebonite knickknacks, fool's gold, imitation ivory and amber, etc. Helmut Carr, who had been naturalized since 1911, is 55 years old. He is a widower. The premises consist of a boutique and, directly in back, a tiny dwelling. Carr eats in a neighborhood restaurant. He has an employee who leaves work at 6 o'clock in the evenings with his shutters closed. Carr usually stayed in the boutique where he would do his bookkeeping. After a look at his records, it would seem that, despite his shabby-looking appearances and modest shopkeeper's lifestyle, he was extremely prosperous. On several occasions, the employee, who is French, had heard Otto Muller insist on having Carr lend him money. One day, he even offered to work for him as a warehouseman or to travel for his trinkets. As an aside, the sand pebbles that were found in Muller's police could have come only from the Quai de Tournelle, from a houseboat that had been unloading there since November 26th. Muller was a big fellow with a shaven head, bushy, dark eyebrows, and a hardened gaze. He was not fat, but to look at his clothes which floated all over him, one could deduce that he had recently lost a lot of weight. He had gray, unshaven cheeks. He wore his worn pelisse, a celluloid, detachable collar, and a clip-on tie. To put it bluntly, Monsieur Froget observed as he pushed his papers aside, "You've spent your entire life trying to find ways to make your jackpot. I was rich at times. When your first wife brought you some money, you were, would you like to tell me what you were doing on November 27th at 6 o'clock in the evening? I went to the movies. Then I went to bed at the Delta Hotel at 3 o'clock in the morning. Pardon, a little after midnight. The floor waiter claims that he opened the door for only one person who had not cried out his name, and that was at 3 o'clock in the morning. How would he have known he's half asleep when he opens the door?" Monsieur Froget seizes and carefully examines the pictures that were taken by the Criminal Records Office on the Rue d'Hauteville. They showed Carr's boutique after it had been ransacked, drawers opened, papers strewn about the counter and on the floor. On the floor, behind the counter, a corpse was bent in half. The gray hair was stuck to the scalp. It was Carr's body, just as the employee had found him the next morning at 8 o'clock. The merchant was in his slippers. The forensic pathologist had attributed the death to a heavy blow to the head from a club, which had been administered with a rare sense of precision, as though the murderer had had all the time in the world. Nonetheless, the death had not been instantaneous. Carr had remained alive for nearly 3 hours, paralyzed and unable to cry for help. The murder had been committed around 9:30 in the evening. Yet, even though Carr was dead, there was then a second blow to the temples at around midnight. Otto Muller had been arrested the next day after accusations brought against him by the employee who, on the 26th, had witnessed a scene between Muller and Carr, which, again was over money. Neither the club nor any other piece of evidence worthy of a conviction were found. Carr was used to keeping around 3,000 to 5,000 francs at home without counting the notes. In his wallet, 3,200 francs were found, as well as a document signed by Muller, attesting to his having received a 500-franc loan on the 25th. The employee gave troubling answers to the questions he was asked. Did Carr usually keep money in his wallet? Never. The money was always kept in a metal box that was placed behind the counter by day and in the employer's room at night. Did he have to go to the bank the day after? He didn't say anything about that. It wasn't a payday. Was the 3,200 franc figure the same amount that was in the boutique that night? I don't know. I worked in the warehouse mostly. Otto Muller was neither humble nor arrogant. He was making a visible effort to fully understand the significance of the questions he was asked, and was looking for the right words to answer them. He did not speak impeccable French. When he used certain terms that he was not sure about, he would pause, look at the judge as though he were seeking some sort of approval. On the 25th, you received 500 francs from Carr. We found the receipt in his pocket. The employee claims that his boss never handed you such large amounts of money a few days earlier. Carr literally threw a pack of 20 francs in your face as he told you to go to hell 1,000 times over. Why was he suddenly so generous on the 25th? Because I promised him that I would go back to Emden with the money he gave you. Yes, even though you still owed 320 francs to the hotel, there would not be enough left for your trip. I intended to leave without paying for the room. Why didn't you go? I was afraid the boss would press charges against me, and I would be stopped at the border. On the day of your arrest, on the 28th to be exact. How much was left from the bundle of cash? 140 francs. After which, to put it bluntly, you were at the end of your rope. I could still work. Why didn't you do it earlier? Otto Muller remains silent, sighs, as though he were resigned to worst possible criticism. Why would I have killed Carr? He asks finally. Did you know that he used to keep his money in a metal box? Yes. He took out the 500 francs from that box. The box had a combination lock, like a safe. Did you know the password? No. The box wasn't found on the Rue d'Hauteville. I don't know. Witnesses. including the owner of the corner cafe, have testified that they saw a light at Carr's place until around 1 in the morning. They could see it through a crack in the shutters, but by morning, the electricity was off. I don't know. The last train for Belgium and Germany departs at 11:30 out of the Gare du Nord station. I don't know. Pardon. On the morning of the 26th, you purchased a train schedule because I promised Carr that I would leave. So you knew what time the train left. It's the only one in Cologne to have a connection for Bremen and Emden. I had forgotten that. No fingerprints were found on the premises, but there is proof that the murderer did not use rubber gloves. He had carefully wiped off every object he touched. This precaution must have taken him more than an hour. I had no motive to kill Carr. I'm innocent. Sea sand was found on your police. As of November 13th, this kind of sand was being unloaded off the Quai des Tournelles. When did you go to the Quai des Tournelles? A week before my arrest. It was on a Monday. I believe around the 17th. I had wanted to commit suicide. I sat on a rock for a long time watching the barges go by. You didn't go to the Quai des Tournelles on the night of the murder? No. I was at the movies. And the day after, no, in fact. 2 detectives came by to pick me up a little before midnight. You had just flushed your 10 grams of cocaine down the toilet. Because I was unable to sell them. You usually had a 5-blade Swiss knife on you. What did you do with it? I don't know. I must have lost it. Unless, of course, it was stolen by one of the bellboys at the hotel. What would you do if I let you walk out of here a free man? I would take the next train to Emden. I've had it with Paris. Who sewed your tie back together? I don't understand. Monsieur Froget pointed to a small black thread which was sticking out. I did. You know how to sew. And you had needles, a thimble, a thread in your room like any traveler. Hand it over. Muller's complexion became jaundiced all of a sudden. His eyes blurred. He threw his tie onto the table and put his head in his 2 hands. A 1,000-franc note had been sewn between the 2 layers of cloth. Monsieur Froget sensed that there was no point in speaking to the man who had just crumbled before him. He would not have heard a thing. Peacefully, he jotted down, "Proof Muller insists that he had gone to the Quai des Tournelles a week before the crime had been committed, even though there was no sea sand at that location before the 26th. Therefore, he must have been there on the night of the murder. But make sure that his presence along the Seine goes unnoticed. Yet, Carr's metal box had not been found. Assumptions. An hour before his arrest. And while the public is still unaware of the murder, Mueller gets rid of the cocaine. And so he expects to be investigated. Existence of the document attesting to the 500-franc debt. Even though the employee asserts that Mueller asked Carr for money the day after that money would have been deposited. It's a way for Mueller to cast suspicion away from himself. Firstly, this explains why he has pocket money on him. Then, he hopes that people would think that if he were the murderer, he would have destroyed that receipt. Facts. Mueller mulls over his plan, writes the receipt with which he will arm himself, along with a club, and enters the boutique at night. Strikes Carr right away as he is slumped over his desk. He is nervous, worried. He seizes the metal box, looks for the key in vain, and runs away with it. Once he is at the Quai des Tournelles, he breaks it open with the help of his knife. He expected, no doubt, to catch the last train so that he could be in Germany when the crime would be discovered. But the box resisted for a long time. Mueller misses his train. He starts to panic, roams the city, anticipates that the employee would point the figure at him. It is at that point that he returns to the Rue d'Hauteville. It's midnight, or shortly thereafter. The body is still warm. Mueller fears he might recover and strikes him for a second time. Then, to cover his tracks, he decides to put some of the money back. He keeps only 1,000-franc note. The smashed box is at the bottom of the Seine. The murderer slides the notes into the dead man's wallet, adds to the disarray, erases the fingerprints, turns off the light and takes off, cautious to the utmost degree. He sews the bill into his tie once he is back in his room. He can rest easier with the knowledge that he has not left a single clue behind him. A crime that is both loathsome and scientific, perpetrated by a mediocre, complicated, and self-absorbed individual. Chapter 13. The first document to be rushed to all the European police stations was a copy of the memorandum that was written by the New York Police Department and published in newspapers all over America. $1,000 reward to anyone with information leading to the arrest of Ronald Morton, also known as Bus, a black man living in Harlem and working as a waiter in a restaurant. Apparent age 25, tall, skinny legs, throws out his chest, low forehead. On May 21st, at the Black and White Bar, Bus, in the midst of a heated discussion, fired 4 shots into the barman, then at the patrons who wanted to intervene. 2 dead, 1 wounded. He then escaped into the neighborhood where he shot the officer in charge of the district, who was trying to block his way. And late that night, as he was hunted in a furnished apartment, he literally gunned down 2 police officers before fleeing along the rooftops. There is every reason to believe that he was not able to leave the city. Second document copy of a wireless transmission from the American authorities. On board the Mauritania, a Negro was spotted aboard traveling illegally. It seems as though he got on from a lifeboat. The crew chased him, fired 2 shots, 1 death, extremely agile, seems to know the boat backwards and forwards. He disappeared. Patrols are sent out day and night. Another message from the American authorities. Negro is spotted for a second time in a second-class compartment. Disappeared. From the Mauritania to the French police. Negro wanted in New York for series of murders aboard. Escaped capture. 1 sailor dead. Urged surveillance of disembarkation. And the chain continued. Link by link. Mobile squad in Le Havre to the police judiciaire in Paris. May 30th. Searched Mauritania. Found nothing. At 6 o'clock in the evening, a Negro is spotted in the red light district. We'll keep you updated. Also from the Mobile squad to the police judiciary. Hectic night. Negro spotted 3 times. Shootout on the Rue Saint-Jacques. A woman wounded. We're watching all train stations and boat departures. Second telegram. Same date. 2 hours later, Bus arrested as he is entering the train station with a first-class ticket to Paris. No employee had handed him the ticket. No resistance. Feigns idiocy. June 5th. A dog would have had to wander the streets of a city for days and nights, hungry. Battered blows and trash aimed at the head. he would have had to have been hunted down by the children themselves, and then they would have abandoned him with such contempt for him to look as pitiful, as desperately humble as Bus. The Negro that Monsieur Froget had before him in his Palais de Justice chambers. The guards who had brought him over told him to sit down, but he didn't understand them, or perhaps pretended not to understand them. They had pushed him around a little, and he had slipped to the edge of the chair in a twisted position. He remained precariously seated. His pupils were dilated, his eyelids swollen, his complexion gray and sweaty. One thing was sure: he had been worked over. But nothing was found to indicate that he was a thief. He hadn't uttered a single word for 4 days since his arrest. He just stared straight ahead, stubbornly or stupidly, with both despair and resignation. When you decide to stop this nonsense, the policeman shouted, and then, wham! He was in pretty bad shape. That was a fact. His clothes were dirty and torn, swollen face, scratches to his hands and wrists. Once he was before Monsieur Froget, he seemed to burst into tears. And incidentally, the tears on his cheeks were real, but silent. One of them was quivering on the dried blood from one of his scratches. From time to time, he would sniffle as softly as possible, as though he were afraid he might be punished by new blows. A supplementary cablegram from New York, read originally from the Belgian Congo. Worked in southern plantations for several years. Starts drinking in Harlem. Becomes violent, but commits no crime before May 21st, nor any serious misdemeanor at all. He was drunk during the series of murders. The bullets were fired from a Colt 12 revolver, a 1913 model, with cylinder. The experts had determined that one of the grooves of the rifling must be irregular. Wearing a light gray three-piece suit, pants with leather belt without suspenders, greenish socks, polished black shoes, had around $300 on him on the night of the crime. A Colt 12 revolver, a 1913 model, with an empty barrel, had been found in the pockets of the Negro who sat collapsed in front of Monsieur Froget. Bus was out of bullets. The Parisian expert who had examined the weapon certified that one of the grooves in the rifling had been falsified, and Bus remained silent, waited for some blows, no doubt, One could see his belly panting like a bird that one holds in one's hand. The American police continued, speaks fluent English, and understands Spanish and Italian. He had been interrogated in each of these 3 languages, with no results. His features had been scrutinized. Not a single tremor. There was something inhuman, pitiful, and revolting all at once. Monsieur Froget, who could speak only French, would not allow himself the absurdity of trying to speak another language. All he wanted was his man before him. Uncharacteristically, he did not remain seated, with one shoulder a little higher than the other, in his favorite position. He walked up and down, as though under the spell of a fever. He rubbed his white and terribly dry hands, one against the other, mechanically, to the point where they sounded like crumpled paper, and from time to time he approached his desk, read through a document, a note. As time passed, the black man imperceptibly lifted his head in wonder and looked at the old man, who wasn't doing anything to him, with a kind of hope. Monsieur Froget managed to pluck the following from a report given by the mobile squad in Le Havre. We were able to seize the following from the Negro's pocket: a revolver. See attached detailed description. $1 in gold and some loose change. A pack of Gauloises with only one missing cigarette. Bus had nothing else on him. And further down, the woman, Elise Claudet, a madam of an establishment called La Venus Maritime, testifies that a Negro wearing a gray 3-piece suit spent a part of the night at her place from the 31st of May to the 1st of June. As he was poorly dressed, she urged him to pay up front, and he placed $100 bill on the table, drinking in the company of 2 girls in one of the sitting rooms of the house. He produced a revolver with only 2 bullets left, which he made a point of mentioning for the sake of anyone who might attempt to prevent him from having a good time. He spoke in English, a language these women were used to. He insisted that one window remain opened, and he made sure he knew what was on the other side of it. Left the house at 3 o'clock in the morning. The 15-page report continued. The deposition from Julien Grosselier, a 55-year-old salesman living in Le Havre. It's worth mentioning that Grosselier is drunk every night, and that he rarely works, I was on my way home. At what time? Around daybreak. I was on my way home, and I was walking by, not far from the train station, when someone went, "Psst." It was a Negro who was speaking to me in English and who promised me 20 francs if I wanted to pick up a ticket to Paris for him at the ticket booth. I asked for a first-class one, and I found him waiting for me outside. How was he dressed? I hadn't noticed, but he was funny. What do you mean by that? He whistled, and when he gave me the 20 francs, he was so happy that he stretched it out to 50. I think that he was a little drew. And you? Hardly. I drink just enough so that I can forget my troubles. The employee from the train station specifies that it was 6 o'clock in the morning when he handed over the ticket. The Negro had been arrested at the tracks of the train station at 8:19. Deposition from the night watchman from the Blackwell docks in Le Havre at around 3 o'clock in the morning. I threw out a damn Negro whom I kicked as he slept in the middle of balls of wool that had been unloaded the night before. He didn't complain. How was he dressed? It was dark, and he got the hitch out in a split second. Monsieur Froget went over, looked the accused right in the eyes, and Bus jumped up, letting some more tears trickle down his cheeks. The psychiatric doctors who had subjected him to a preliminary examination claimed that they could diagnose him only after he'd been placed under observation. In any case, stricken with a serious illness, there were no signs of insanity. The magistrate suddenly opened the door and called for a guard. Take off his shoes. The Negro offered no resistance. He revealed bloody, swollen feet. Has this man been sleeping with his shoes on for several days? Yes. And with all his clothes on, his legs, caked with sweat and mud, were thin. There were a few strands of raw wool that had been stuck to them. Bus was as pitiful and grotesque as ever, sitting on his chair, with his bare feet and his dangling arms, which seemed excessively long. The guard left the room in disgust, holding his own hands away from his body because he had touched the accused's feet. Having reached a peak of irritation, Monsieur Froget scrambled all of the file's documents, which sported a myriad of different letterheads, walked towards the window, retraced his steps. He was about to continue to speak to Bus in the same manner as he had been doing, but he shut his mouth before uttering a single syllable, and he brusquely opened the door again and called for the guard. "This is a measuring stick. Do you know how to measure a foot size?" A few moments later, the guard announced, "It's a 46. The foot, 44. But it's a very fine leather, and it's expandable." The Negro stared fixedly at an abrasion on his hand. No bits of wool in the cracks in the leather. None. But some charcoal. Look. This shoe right here is full. Monsieur Froget shot a look at his desk, and his eyes fell on a sentence within the report Colt revolver. 12 mm caliber, 1913 model. "You can leave now," he said to the guard. It was by chance that I ran into Monsieur Froget that day, less than an hour after what can with difficulty be called the Negro's interrogation. And before finding out what was happening, I noticed that there was something unusual about him, a sort of joy that he did not want to let out, as well as, admittedly, a touch of bitterness. "I know of nothing more sinister," he told me, "than seeing a person suffer who doesn't know why he is suffering, such as an animal or a simple." It was then that he revealed the case to me, as I have tried to tell it, and concluded right from the start. I had gathered several presumptions of innocence from the man. First of all, the stupid manner in which he allowed himself to be apprehended. He, who had hitherto shown himself to be a master of escape. Then the fact that there were bullets in neither his revolver nor his pockets, and that he had nonetheless kept such a compromising weapon. The further fact that this man, who had accumulated quite a list of victims, would allow himself to be chased without protest by a night watchman. The fact that he must have seen that the station was being watched when he sent someone off to buy his ticket, and I'm omitting some points. As for the proof, I only got it at the end, by accident, by looking at his feet that he couldn't figure out how to make touch the floor. He indeed wore polished shoes that were indicated by the American police, but they were 2 sizes too small, and yet one cannot perform such acrobatics under those conditions. And above all, Bus, who had money, had no reason to wear shoes that were too short and too narrow for him. Therefore, it wasn't Bus, whom I had before me, he added, after a moment of silence. Now everything has become simple. No one would dream of innocently playing the role that the accused had played, even for such a sum. And so he had to have been acting naturally. And so he knows neither French, nor English, nor Spanish, nor Italian. He doesn't know anything furthermore. He has something on his conscience, since he is not even indignant about the police brutality that was inflicted on him. The telephone investigation that I've just performed confirmed my suppositions. We are dealing with an unfortunate Negro from the Upper Congo who had heard so much about Europe that he had but one dream: to come over and make his fortune here. A rather unscrupulous compatriot working in the storeroom on a cargo ship made him pay a pretty penny in exchange for his fraudulent passage within the coal supply, and abandoned him in Le Havre without a sou, without the means to communicate with anyone at all. The man who had fallen from the pedestal of his dream wanders about like an errant soul in pain, sleeps on the docks, feels miserable and guilty, gives up. That night, he is chased out of the stack of wool on which he was sleeping. He must not yet have been wearing Bus's shoes because, while bits of wool had been found on his legs, there were none in the cracks in the leather of worn-out shoes. The American meets him, sizes up the truth in the blink of an eye, as he too has African roots, and he had succumbed to the same naive feelings. The real Bus is being hunted down. He's at the end of his rope. What an opportunity! He bamboozles the other black man who suspects nothing and is dazzled by a gold coin and some cigarettes. He gives him clothes, the revolver prudently unloaded, and sends him off on the next train to Paris, after having procured the ticket for him, before anyone catches wind of the truth. Bus would have enough time to make it to safety. I found out later that Monsieur Froget had saved the poor soul from the sentence he would have received for having traveled illegally, and that he had personally paid for his return trip to Congo. As for Bus, he had been killed by 3 stab wounds a few days later in a brothel in Rouen, where he was spending his last dollars. Conclusion: the case of the 13 suspects finally comes to an end. The truth is revealed. The criminals are held accountable, but through it, Froget realizes that people are always complex. Their motives are multidimensional and full of contradictions. Paris, the city of light and shadow, continues to tell its unheard stories. Monsieur Froget, the truth hunter, continues his journey, facing new conspiracies, secrets, and challenges in a world filled with cunning. Life and justice go hand in hand. And Froget, with his sharp intellect and patience, will forever be the one to shine the light of truth in the darkness